Oh, hi there. Thanks for stopping by. It's been a little while, but I'm glad to see you. I hope the feeling is mutual. So, you ready for part two? I hope so. Disarming our past. If you remember, we were talking about Jesus and how he met people who were suffering and connected with them in a way that helped them in their burden. But a lot more than that, of course. If you haven't watched part one, you can go back and do that before we chat. Okay. Well, what I want to look at today is the first person I mentioned in the last time we talked was about a woman who had gone through some very, very difficult circumstances, to say the least. There's a passage in the Bible that I want to look at. I'm going to be reading from the book of the Bible of Mark, chapter 5, verses 25 to 36. But this story can also be found in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 8, and also in the book of Matthew in chapter 9. And there's two stories here, but we're just going to focus on one. And when Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. That is Jesus. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned around in the crowd, saying, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowds pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." It's hard to imagine, really, today. Maybe you've known someone who's experienced something like this. It's actually something probably women are much more adept at understanding through their own personal experience, every month. But I think men, we perhaps can also kind of get a clue on this. But basically, what was going on here is we could say that she had a period for 12 years. Imagine that, 12 years. Now, we don't know exactly what was happening physiologically, but in essence, that's what it was. That's what it amounted to. And there were all kinds of burdens that came as a result of that. This woman carried great burdens, perhaps greater than anything that we've carried, perhaps not as much. Maybe it doesn't matter, but we can see how Jesus met someone in their burdens. I want to mention a few of the burdens that she carried. One was just the physical burden of the infirmity, the disease. Having a period for 12 years, I can hardly imagine that, especially in those days when they don't have the same kind of sanitary abilities that we do today. And also, if you're bleeding that much, anemia and other things that might come with it, just imagine the constant cramps and the headaches and all the other things that might come from consistently losing blood over time. And this woman had to bear that for 12 years. Maybe you have a physical infirmity. Maybe, I'm sure we've all experienced something, whether it's anything from skinning our knee to breaking a bone, or maybe even having cancer, or having a heart attack or stroke, or being paralyzed. There's so many other things. On December 18th last year, I had to get my ACL repaired in surgery. And boy, that was rough, even just trying to walk. We've all experienced something like that. She also carried a mental and emotional burden. I mean, just imagine the mental weight. The physical was bad enough, but what makes the physical so bad is not just the physical pain and discomfort, but the emotional weight that comes with it. the emotional burden. Just imagine how depressed she would have been having experienced this for 12 years. And you can see that in the sense of desperation, where in the passage it talks about, she said, if only I can touch his garment. That's kind of a sort of a sounding like desperation. Or in another passage, Jesus says, take heart, after he heals her, which tells me that yes, she was experiencing all kinds of stress and duress and depression. I've experienced that before. I bet you have too, to some degree, maybe more than you care to admit. Uh, Many things can cause depression, anxiety, burdens that we can barely care to want to mention, suffering in silence, or maybe we do have some support, but the pain still doesn't go away. I know I've been there. I've gone through many troubles, and in fact, our last conversation, I've talked about some of them. Well, there was also a financial burden. If you remember in the passage, it said that she had spent all her living, or another place it spent all that she had. Just imagine spending all her money on doctor bills, like all of it. And I know that some of you can relate to that. I've been fortunate. You may recall I was a chaplain in the Army, and so I have some medical insurance from the VA. It's not always as good as I would like, but I have that benefit. But still, sometimes I have problems with things. But I bet a lot of you may not have that benefit, and you're wondering, how can you pay your doctor bills? It's horrible. I don't want to get too far into that, because I don't want this to be about anything related to policy or anything like that. But the point is that can be, financial burdens can be incredible. My wife and I, we've had times when we were struggling so much that we had to use a credit card to pay for food and gas. We're doing much better now. I think we probably could be doing a bit better, but maybe we all could say that. But I'm sure you can understand what it's like to be in financial burden. Maybe you have huge debts. Maybe you're not making it from week to week, month to month. Well, this woman here, she was barely making it at all. In fact, it's possible that she could have been homeless, or at the very least, she was carrying a social burden, the fourth burden that I wanted to mention, of her being isolated. You see, in those days, the Old Testament laws and customs were that when a woman was on her cycle, she was regarded as unclean. I don't want to get too much into that and try to explain nuances of that, but suffice it to say, that's what was going on in the culture. And so her family would not have wanted her around. They would not have allowed her to be around, and she wouldn't have been able to go to the places of worship, not able to go to the regular markets. The Bible doesn't tell us how she got her food and where she had shelter, but the thing is that this woman was a social outcast, undoubtedly a social outcast for 12 years. We don't know if this woman was a mother, and if so, she was not able to be around her children. We don't know if she was a wife, and if so, she wasn't able to be around her husband, wasn't able to be around her parents, wasn't able to be around anybody. And anyone who saw her and knew her would have been just steering clear and want nothing to do with her at all. I've been in situations like that. I know there was a time in high school, I'm just thinking in particular, where there's a situation that I won't say wasn't entirely, where I was completely guiltless, but over something really silly, I was completely ostracized by almost all of my friends. And they literally went on this campaign to isolate me. It's a story, and maybe I'll tell it to you later. But for the second half of my senior year, I was a complete outcast. I was also kind of nerdy, and different times growing up, and other times in school I was bullied. I'm sure you know about what it's like to be on the outside. But this woman, she was a complete outcast. And maybe that's how you feel. Maybe you feel like an outcast. Maybe you feel like you don't belong. Maybe you don't even feel like you belong in your own home, in your own church, at your job, in your school. You feel unseen. There have been plenty of other times that I have felt that way. this huge burden that she carried, the stigma, the stigma. And I think many of us have situations where we have a stigma that we're dealing with, and so we keep it hidden. Wasn't sure if I wanted to share this, but when I came out of the military, I was slapped with a diagnosis, and I didn't really want to talk about it. And thank the Lord, I'm doing so much better now that the diagnosis doesn't rule me. But it wasn't something that I wanted to spread around because of a stigma. And the thing is, there are plenty of people who thought they knew what was going on and yet really had no idea what was going on and created their own narrative because of stigma. I bet some of you are experiencing that right now. Let's see, what this passage shows us is just one example of Jesus meeting a person who is experiencing these kind of burdens, whether it's a physical burden, it's an emotional, mental burden, a financial burden, a social kind of burden, all different kinds of burdens. And we can go through a list and describe more clearly all the different nuances that she was going through. But I hope the point is made. But here's the interesting thing. When she touched Jesus's garment, and she was hiding, right? Because again, she was regarded as unclean. She didn't want anyone to know what she was doing. Otherwise, they would have sent her away and prevented her from connecting with Jesus. And she knew that Jesus was her only hope. And so she reached out and she was physically healed. But then Jesus, like, who touched me? Who touched me? And Jesus knew. Jesus knew. He's the Son of God, Almighty God in the flesh. He knew. And the woman was terrified because she didn't want to be called out, but he called her out not to embarrass her, but to restore her. To restore her, because by him calling her out and her coming forward, everyone saw what happened. And they would see this woman who had been unclean now declared clean and healed and restored, being able to be restored with all her family, friends, loved ones, the culture that she was living in, the community that she was part of. We carry a lot of burdens. I know I've carried a lot of burdens. And I know you've carried a lot of burdens. And I want us to look at this and realize that ultimately Jesus is the one who can bear our burdens. He wants to bear our burdens if we come to him. Even if all we can do is just reach out and, figuratively speaking, touch the hem of his garment. Maybe we can't even reach out, and all we can do is cry out, Lord, help me, save me, I believe, help my unbelief. Reach out to Jesus. Maybe you don't exactly know how, but right now, just call out to him. Call out to him. We're going to talk about this more because, despite all these burdens, there's an even greater burden beyond the physical, the social, the financial, the emotional. There's a greater burden here that Jesus bears that goes beyond anything that we can really imagine the magnitude of. We're not going to talk about that right now, but just want to make sure you understand that Jesus will meet you where you are at. He is there for you to reach out to. He is there for you to call out to. If you haven't called out to him before, call out now. And if you have called him out to him before and you're struggling, keep calling. He's there. He'll meet you, even if it just means touching the hem of his garment. Anyway, I got to get back to doing some work. I have to get on to part 3. I'm glad you stopped by. And hey, don't be a stranger. Until we meet again.